The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of Courtroom 237, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches, where spectators sat in anxious anticipation, their hushed whispers creating a steady hum that filled the marbled chamber like angry bees. Sarah Thompson stood just outside the heavy oak doors, her fingers unconsciously smoothing the lapel of her charcoal Armani suit as her attorney whispered final words of encouragement. The prestigious downtown courthouse had seen its share of high-profile cases, but something felt different about this one. Reporters from major networks huddled near the entrance, their cameras ready to capture every moment of what they believed would be a simple open and shut case of corporate fraud involving yet another minority executive. The story they thought they knew was one they'd written countless times before. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to enter her Harvard Law ring, catching the light, a silent reminder of the years of dedication that had brought her to this moment. At 32, she had already climbed to the position of senior financial analyst at one of the city's most respected firms, only to find herself standing accused of the very type of fraud she had dedicated her career to preventing. The doors swung open and Sarah stepped forward, her Louboutin heels striking a steady rhythm against the marble floor that seemed to echo the pounding of her heart. Every head in the courtroom turned to watch her entrance, some with curiosity, others with predetermined judgment, but it was the calculating stare from the bench that sent a chill down her spine. Judge William Harrison regarded her with the same expression he had worn in every preliminary hearing, a look of barely concealed disdain that spoke volumes about his predetermined views. The judge sat high above the proceedings, his black robes seeming to absorb the morning light like a dark star, pulling all energy toward him. His reputation preceded him in legal circles, where defense attorneys spoke in worried whispers about his handling of cases involving minority defendants, his record of harsh sentences raising eyebrows, but never quite enough evidence to prove bias. Sarah had researched him extensively, knowing that her future rested in his hands, finding that his 20-year career was marked by controversial decisions that somehow always managed to survive appeal. As Sarah made her way to the defense table, her mind flickered to the irony of her situation. Just 3 months ago, she had been celebrated in the financial press for developing an algorithmic system to detect institutional fraud. Her innovation had already saved 3 major banks from potential losses in the millions, yet here she stood accused of manipulating the very systems she had helped create to protect against such crimes. The gallery behind her filled with faces she recognized, partners from her firm who had come either out of support or morbid curiosity, junior analysts who had once sought her mentorship, and even a few competitors who could barely hide their satisfaction at her current predicament. The weight of their stares pressed against her back, but Sarah maintained her composure, her years in corporate boardrooms having taught her the power of an unshakable demeanor. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the low murmur of the courtroom like a knife. Conversations died mid-sentence and notebooks snapped open as he shifted in his chair, studying Sarah with the kind of look reserved for something unpleasant found on the bottom of a shoe. His fingers drummed against his bench in a gesture of impatience that seemed to communicate he had already decided the outcome long before hearing a single piece of evidence. The court clerk began the formal proceedings, her voice carrying the practiced monotony of someone who had announced thousands of cases, but even she paused briefly when reading the charges, the sheer volume and complexity of the alleged financial crimes standing in stark contrast to the poised young woman standing before the court. The prosecution had painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal mastermind, while Sarah stood calm and dignified, every inch the corporate executive she had worked so hard to become. As the morning light continued to stream through the windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like golden sparklers, Sarah could feel the weight of the moment settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She knew that beyond the immediate charges, this case would set precedents that would echo through corporate corridors and courtrooms for years to come. What she didn't know was that this day would unveil truths far more personal and shocking than anyone in Courtroom 237 could have possibly imagined. The legal community of the city held many open secrets, but none quite as troubling as the shadow that hung over Judge William Harrison's courtroom. Defense attorneys had developed an entire underground system of trading favors to avoid having their cases assigned to his docket, especially when representing minority clients. The statistics told a story that no one dared to voice openly, yet everyone knew to be true. Behind the polished mahogany panels of the judge's chambers, whispers had circulated for years like persistent ghosts, haunting the halls of justice. Linda Chen, his former clerk, had quietly transferred out after just 3 months, citing professional differences, but those in the know had seen her tears after he had berated a young Hispanic defendant with such vitriol that even the court reporter had struggled to maintain composure. That case, like so many others, had ended with a sentence far exceeding standard guidelines. The morning newspaper sat folded on Judge Harrison's desk, its headlines screaming about racial disparities in sentencing across the state, but his record somehow always managed to fly just under the radar of formal investigation, his political connections reaching deep into the city's power structure like roots of an old poisoned tree. His fellow judges turned blind eyes to the pattern, knowing their own careers could suffer from speaking out against one of their own. As Sarah sat at the defense table, her attorney shuffled through papers with practiced efficiency, watching Judge Harrison from the corner of his eye. The lawyer had seen too many cases in this courtroom where justice seemed to wear a different face depending on the defendant sitting before it. Meteorological records would show that defendants of color somehow always faced longer sentences on cloudy days when the judge's mood turned as dark as the gathering storms. The courthouse archives held the receipts of Judge Harrison's bias hidden in plain sight within thousands of pages of court transcripts where he had dismissed character witnesses for successful minority defendants as obviously coached, questioned the legitimacy of their academic credentials, and systematically excluded evidence of community involvement and professional achievements. Yet every appeal had fallen short of proving explicit prejudice, his careful choice of words maintaining plausible deniability. A young law clerk fresh out of school sat in the back of the courtroom, scribbling furiously in her notebook, documenting every raised eyebrow, every dismissive gesture, and every interruption from the bench. She was building her own case, a pattern of behavior that might one day see the light of day if someone brave enough came along to champion the cause. Her presence, a silent testament to the growing resistance against the old guard of the justice system. The defense bar had their own unofficial spreadsheet tracking sentencing disparities in Judge Harrison's courtroom, where white-collar crimes committed by certain defendants carried penalties nearly double those of similar cases with different demographics. The numbers told a story that could no longer be ignored, yet the system seemed powerless or unwilling to address the elephant in the room that sat high above them all in black robes and unquestioned authority. Through the years, complaints have been filed, of course, formal objections raised by dedicated attorneys fighting against the tide, but Judge Harrison had cultivated powerful allies in the district attorney's office, the police union, and the Judicial Review Board. His campaign contributions, flowing from law firms that somehow always saw their white clients receive suspended sentences, while others faced the full weight of his judicial wrath. Even now, as Sarah sat before him, his eyes barely concealed the contempt that had become his trademark. In cases like hers, his fingers drumming against his bench in that familiar pattern that seasoned attorneys had learned to recognize as the prelude to another harsh ruling, the gathered observers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, knowing they were witnessing yet another chapter in a long history of judicial prejudice. The morning light streaming through the courtroom windows caught the edge of an award hanging on the wall behind the bench: judicial excellence in maintaining professional standards. The irony of the recognition lost on no one who had witnessed the subtle and not so subtle ways Judge Harrison administered his particular brand of justice, the plaque itself seeming to mock the very principles it claimed to celebrate. What no one in the courtroom yet realized was that this case would become the turning point, the moment when 2 decades of carefully maintained prejudice would finally begin to unravel like a loose thread in the judge's robes. The truth that was about to emerge would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world and force a reckoning that would echo through the halls of justice for years to come. The tension in courtroom 237 crackled like static electricity as Sarah Thompson took the witness stand, her shoulders squared against the wave of hostile energy radiating from the bench where Judge Harrison loomed like a storm cloud about to burst. The morning had already seen him sustain every prosecutorial objection while dismissing defense motions with barely concealed impatience. Sarah began her testimony with the confidence earned through years of boardroom presentations, her voice steady as she explained the sophisticated financial monitoring system she had developed to detect fraudulent transactions. The algorithm, she explained, had already prevented millions in potential losses at 3 major banking institutions, her hands moving with practiced precision as she sketched complex flowcharts on the court's digital display. Judge Harrison shifted restlessly in his chair, his expression darkening with each academic term and technical specification that flowed effortlessly from Sarah's lips, her pristine credentials and obvious expertise clearly disrupting his predetermined narrative about her capabilities. The air grew heavier with each passing moment as he searched for any opportunity to undermine her testimony. "You expect us to believe," the judge interrupted, his voice dripping with skepticism, "that someone of your background can develop such a sophisticated system?" His emphasis on "you're" making his meaning crystal clear to everyone in the courtroom. Sarah paused, her fingers still hovering over the digital display, as whispers rippled through the gallery at the judge's obvious prejudice. With remarkable composure, Sarah reached into the evidence folder, pulling out her patent's official documentation from the Securities and Exchange Commission and letters of commendation from some of the most prestigious financial institutions in the country, the evidence of her expertise mounting like an impenetrable wall against the judge's bias, each document telling its own story of excellence and innovation. The prosecution seemed increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah methodically dismantled their case, explaining how she had actually discovered the real fraud attempt and reported it to the proper authorities. Her testimony, supported by email chains, internal memos, and timestamps that created an airtight timeline of events that proved her innocence. Yet Judge Harrison continued to interrupt with increasingly hostile comments. "Perhaps, Ms. Thompson, you could explain it in simpler terms," the judge sneered, clearly implying she was using complex language to obscure the truth. The gallery collectively held its breath at the obvious slight, but Sarah remained unshaken, launching into an even more detailed explanation of financial algorithms and security protocols, her Harvard Business Review publications projected on the courtroom screen behind her. The court reporter, fingers flying across her stenotype machine, struggled to keep pace with the technical terminology, while the jury sat transfixed by Sarah's clear and compelling testimony, even the most skeptical members finding themselves nodding along as she walked them through the complex financial systems she had helped safeguard. Every time Sarah referenced her achievements, Judge Harrison would make a show of examining his fingernails or checking his watch, his dismissive behavior becoming so obvious that even the courtroom sketch artist had begun incorporating his expressions of disdain into their drawings. The legal community, observers in the gallery, exchanging knowing glances at each fresh display of prejudice. When Sarah presented the actual code she had written to prevent fraud, Judge Harrison waved his hand, dismissively suggesting that anyone could copy and paste from the internet, his comment revealing both his technical ignorance and his determination to diminish her accomplishments. The young law clerk in the back of the courtroom, frantically documenting every biased remark for what would surely become grounds for appeal. The breaking point came when Sarah displayed her innovation awards from Silicon Valley and Wall Street, the judge suddenly sitting up straight, his face flushing with anger as he realized the defendant before him had received recognition he could barely comprehend, let alone dismiss. "You will restrict your testimony to the charges at hand," he bellowed, his gavel crashing down with enough force to make the water glasses on the counsel tables jump. But Sarah remained steadfast, her voice never wavering as she connected the dots between her legitimate work in fraud prevention and the false accusations against her, the evidence mounting in her favor, becoming impossible to ignore, even as Judge Harrison tried desperately to steer the narrative back toward his predetermined conclusion, the truth of her innocence shining through, despite his best efforts to overshadow it. The morning wore on, with Sarah maintaining her professional demeanor in the face of increasingly hostile interruptions from the bench, her testimony building an irrefutable case for her innocence that would soon be overshadowed by a revelation that would shake the very foundations of Judge Harrison's carefully constructed world. Dark clouds gathered outside the courthouse windows, nature itself seeming to mirror the ominous atmosphere within courtroom 237 as Judge Harrison prepared to render his verdict. The prosecutor's case had disintegrated over the past few days, revealing itself to be built on assumptions and prejudices rather than actual evidence, yet the judge's demeanor suggested he had something else in mind. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the tension etched on every face in the gallery, where spectators sat forward on the aged wooden benches, their collective breath held as they watched the judge shuffle through his papers. With deliberate slowness, the evidence that should have exonerated Sarah Thompson lay in neat stacks before him, each document telling its own story of her innocence. The defense team had systematically demolished the prosecution's allegations, showing how Sarah had not only prevented the alleged embezzlement, but had created the very system that detected it in the first place. Her algorithm had flagged suspicious transactions worth millions, leading to the arrest of the real perpetrators, yet Judge Harrison had methodically blocked every attempt to enter this evidence, treating each defense motion with barely concealed contempt. Thunder rolled outside as Sarah sat perfectly still at the defense table, her Harvard law ring catching the dim light filtering through the storm-darkened windows. Behind her sat rows of supporters, including the CEO of Goldman Stanley, the SEC chairwoman, and numerous financial industry leaders who had testified to her character and achievements, their presence a silent rebuke to the judge's obvious bias. Judge Harrison had spent the morning making unprecedented rulings, striking testimony that clearly supported Sarah's innocence from the record, his justifications becoming increasingly thin as he worked to shape the narrative toward his predetermined conclusion. The court reporter had given up trying to maintain a neutral expression, her fingers flying across the keys as she documented what many whispered would surely become grounds for appeal. The prosecution team shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, looking more like reluctant hostages than advocates for justice as the judge systematically stripped away their ability to acknowledge the mounting evidence of Sarah's innocence, their original theory of the case having crumbled in the face of irrefutable proof that she had been the whistleblower, not the perpetrator. Rain began to lash against the windows, creating a dramatic backdrop as Judge Harrison cleared his throat, preparing to speak. The young law clerk who had been documenting his behavior throughout the trial gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white, knowing she was about to witness either a moment of judicial redemption or one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in the court's history. Sarah maintained her composure even as Judge Harrison began to read from his prepared statement, his voice dripping with the same condescension that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. The gallery listened in growing disbelief as he dismissed the testimony of world-renowned experts as irrelevant and described Sarah's innovative financial security system as suspiciously complex. The defense attorney rose repeatedly to object, his motions dying in the thunderous atmosphere as Judge Harrison spoke over him, the judge's voice rising to compete with the storm outside as he constructed an alternate reality where Sarah's achievements became suspicious, her expertise became unlikely, and her innocence became impossible, his prejudices laid bare in every carefully chosen word. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the faces of the jury who sat in uncomfortable silence, their expressions suggesting they saw through the judge's manipulation, but felt powerless to prevent what was unfolding before them, their notes documenting Sarah's innocence rendered meaningless by judicial authority gone rogue. The storm reached its crescendo as Judge Harrison approached his conclusion, his reputation for harsh sentences hanging over the courtroom like a sword of Damocles ready to fall on Sarah. Despite the mountain of exculpatory evidence, the distinguished witnesses, and the obvious collapse of the prosecution's case, the judge seemed determined to make an example of her, his prejudice having found its perfect target, or so he thought. No one in the courtroom could have predicted how the next few moments would unfold as Judge Harrison raised his gavel ready to pronounce a sentence that would have ended Sarah's career and sent shockwaves through the financial industry. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, carrying with them a truth that would shatter his carefully constructed world forever. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 237 flew open with such force that the sound echoed like a thunderclap through the chamber, causing Judge Harrison to freeze mid-sentence, his gavel hovering in the air like a suspended moment in time. Through the doors strode Margaret Harrison, her silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights, her vintage civil rights era jacket worn like armor, and her presence immediately commanding attention from every soul in the room. The elegant woman moved with the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting battles in courtrooms across America, her eyes locked onto Judge William Harrison with an intensity that made him physically recoil, the gavel slipping from his fingers and clattering against the bench with a sound that seemed to break the spell of silence that had fallen over the gathered crowd. Margaret Harrison was a legend in civil rights circles, her name spoken with reverence in law schools across the country for her role in desegregating 5 school districts, her work alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and her tireless advocacy for judicial reform. The weight of her accomplishments seemed to press against the very air of the courtroom as she made her way down the center aisle, her heels striking a rhythm that sounded like justice itself approaching. Court officers stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected intrusion, their training failing them in the face of such commanding presence. Several of them actually stepped back as Margaret passed, their instincts telling them that to impede her progress would be like trying to stop a force of nature. The woman moved with the inevitability of approaching destiny, her eyes never leaving the face of her son, who seemed to shrink with each step she took. The journalists in attendance scrambled for their notepads, recognizing Margaret Harrison instantly, her reputation preceding her like a wave through the gallery. Whispers erupted as people began to piece together the connection between the legendary civil rights activist and the judge who sat paralyzed behind his bench, his face draining of color, as his mother approached the point where Sarah Thompson stood. Time seemed to slow as Margaret reached out and took Sarah's hand in hers, the gesture containing decades of family history, untold stories, and secrets about to be revealed. The contrast between the elderly white woman and the young black defendant created a picture that would later grace the front pages of newspapers across the country, though none of the photographers present could capture the electric tension that filled the air. Judge Harrison gripped the edges of his bench, his knuckles white as he watched his mother stand beside the woman he had spent days demeaning and dismissing, his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack like thin ice under pressure, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out the storm that still raged outside the courthouse windows, his past and present colliding in a moment that would define his future. The gallery had fallen into such profound silence that the sound of Margaret Harrison's leather purse being placed on the defense table echoed through the chamber like a judge's gavel, the symbolism lost on no one as she positioned herself firmly beside Sarah, her presence transforming the defense table into what felt like the bench of a higher court of justice preparing to pass judgment, not on the defendant but on the judge himself. Those seated close enough could see Judge Harrison's hands trembling as he shuffled papers on his bench, attempting to maintain some semblance of judicial authority, even as his mother's mere presence stripped away decades of carefully maintained pretense, the weight of his own prejudices suddenly visible to him in the reflection of her unwavering gaze. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath, the thunder pausing and the lightning settling into a distant rumble, as though nature itself waited to hear what would happen next in this courtroom, where justice had so often been perverted by prejudice. Margaret Harrison stood like a living statue of justice, her hand still firmly gripping Sarah's, her eyes boring into her son with a kind of disappointment that only a mother can convey. The next words spoken in that courtroom would shatter the foundations of everything Judge William Harrison had built, his career, his reputation, and his carefully hidden biases, all balanced on the edge of a revelation that his mother was about to deliver. The truth she carried would not only expose his prejudice, but would force him to confront the deepest contradiction of his life in the form of the sister he had chosen to forget. Margaret Harrison stood in the center of courtroom 237 like a bridge between two worlds, her presence connecting past and present in a way that made time itself seem to hold its breath, her eyes never leaving her son's face, as she prepared to speak words that would shatter his carefully constructed reality. The gathered crowd leaning forward, collectively drawn by the gravitational pull of the moment about to unfold. The legendary civil rights activist who had marched alongside Dr. King organized sit-ins across the South and fought countless battles for equality in courtrooms much like this one, shifted her gaze between her son on the bench and Sarah at the defense table, the connection between them visible now to those who knew where to look in the shape of their eyes, the set of their jaws, and the stubborn determination that radiated from them both. William, she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of activism and maternal authority, do you remember the summer of 1985 when we sat in this very courthouse, your father and I finalizing the adoption papers for a brilliant little girl who would become your sister? The words hit Judge Harrison like physical blows, each one cracking the facade he had maintained for so many years, his face contorting with the effort to maintain composure. The gallery erupted in whispers as Margaret continued her story, describing how she and her late husband had adopted a young black girl whose intellectual gifts had already been apparent at age 7, how that same girl had gone on to excel in every academic challenge, growing into a woman whose achievements would make any family proud, her voice steady, as she revealed the truth that Judge William Harrison had spent decades trying to forget. Sarah Thompson, your sister, Margaret declared, the words echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap, stands before you today accused of crimes she not only did not commit but actively worked to prevent. The same dedication to justice that your father and I tried to instill in both our children, evident in her every action. While you, William, she paused, her disappointment filling the silence, have allowed your prejudices to corrupt the very principles we raised you to uphold. Judge Harrison gripped his bench so tightly the wood creaked beneath his fingers, his carefully maintained professional mask crumbling as long-buried memories forced their way to the surface. Sunday dinners, where Sarah had debated economic theory with their father, family game nights, where she had consistently beaten him at chess, graduation ceremonies, where she had collected honors while he had sat in the audience, his pride already beginning to twist into something darker. The court reporter sat frozen, her fingers hovering over the keys as the story unfolded before her, the journalists in attendance scribbling frantically, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would send shockwaves through the judicial system. The young law clerk who had been documenting the judge's bias throughout the trial, now understanding she held in her notes evidence of something far more personal than institutional prejudice. Sarah stood tall beside her adopted mother, her Harvard law ring catching the light as Margaret squeezed her hand, the gesture speaking of years of bedtime stories, homework help, and holiday celebrations, a family bond that Judge Harrison had deliberately erased from his public life. As he climbed the ranks of the judiciary, his political ambitions slowly poisoning his relationship with the sister whose achievements he now found himself trying to diminish. The prosecutors sat in stunned silence, their case suddenly revealed as an unwitting instrument of a judge's personal prejudice. The distinguished character witnesses who had testified to Sarah's brilliance and integrity now understood why their words had provoked such hostile reactions from the bench. Each of Sarah's achievements had been a reminder to William Harrison of the sister he had chosen to forget. Through the courthouse windows the storm had begun to clear, as though nature itself acknowledged that the real turbulence now lay within these walls, where a family drama decades in the making had burst into public view. Margaret Harrison stood as both witness and judge, her presence forcing a reckoning not just with personal prejudice but with the larger questions of justice, equality, and the corrupting influence of power. The silence that followed her revelation felt heavy with the weight of understanding, as every person in that courtroom recognized they were witnessing not just the exposure of one judge's bias, but a moment that would force the entire justice system to confront its own prejudices. The truth about Sarah Thompson's identity would soon spread beyond these walls, challenging assumptions and demanding change in courtrooms across the country. Judge William Harrison seemed to physically shrink behind his bench, the powerful authority figure who had terrorized defendants for decades reduced to a small boy withering under his mother's disappointed gaze. Memories he had locked away for years came rushing back with devastating clarity. Holiday dinners, where Sarah had announced her acceptance to Harvard, his congratulations tasting like ashes in his mouth as his own judicial ambitions began to clash with having a black sister. The weight of his hypocrisy pressed down on him like a physical force as he remembered Sarah's law school graduation, how he had made excuses not to attend, claiming a heavy caseload when in truth he had been cultivating relationships with conservative judicial committees, his carefully crafted image as a tough-on-crime judge, leaving no room for acknowledgement of his adopted sister, whose very existence complicated the narrative he had chosen to embrace. From his elevated position behind the bench, Judge Harrison could see the faces of every person in the courtroom, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust as they processed the revelation. The court officers who had always jumped to enforce his orders now stood uncertainly by the walls, their allegiance visibly shifting as they witnessed the unraveling of a man they had feared and respected. The young law clerk in the back furiously documenting every detail of his very public humiliation. Fragments of childhood memories tormented him, Sarah helping him study for his own law school entrance exams, her brilliant mind making complex legal concepts crystal clear. The same expertise he had spent the last few days dismissing and demeaning, he saw now in perfect clarity how each snide comment, each interruption, each dismissive gesture had been an attempt to destroy the evidence of his own betrayal. The distinguished witnesses who had testified to Sarah's character now stared at him with undisguised contempt, their presence taking on new meaning as he realized that his sister had achieved everything he had and more without compromising her integrity. The CEO of Goldman Stanley was whispering to his lawyer while staring directly at the bench, no doubt already planning the judicial ethics complaint that would end a career built on carefully hidden prejudice. Margaret Harrison remained standing, her hand still firmly gripping Sarah's, her posture radiating a strength that seemed to draw power from every civil rights battle she had fought, every march she had led, every victory she had won in courtrooms across the country. She had spent her life fighting against men like the one her son had become. The irony of this fact hitting Judge Harrison with the force of a physical blow. The prosecutors shuffled their papers, refusing to meet anyone's eyes as they realized they had been unwitting pawns in a judge's personal vendetta. Their case against Sarah, revealed as nothing more than an instrument of William Harrison's displaced self-hatred. The young assistant district attorney was already drafting a motion to dismiss, her hands shaking as she wrote. Lightning flashed outside the courthouse windows, illuminating the chamber in stark bursts that felt like nature's own judgment on the scene unfolding within. Judge Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but found no words, his usual judicial authority deserting him in the face of his mother's unwavering stare and the sister whose achievements he had tried so hard to diminish. The gallery had fallen into a silence so complete that the sound of papers shuffling seemed to echo off the marble walls. The journalists present understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in legal history, a story that would dominate headlines and force conversations about judicial bias across the nation. The young law student who had been sketching the proceedings throughout the trial had captured the exact moment of the judge's realization, his face a study in dawning horror. Judge Harrison's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass, his Harvard law ring clinking against the crystal within sound that seemed to mock him. A twin to the ring Sarah wore, the symbol of achievement he had tried to question when she wore it, now damning evidence of their shared history and his betrayal. The water spilled as he tried to drink, his carefully maintained control deserting him as 30 years of shame crashed down around him. The storm outside had begun to clear, but inside courtroom 237 a different kind of storm was building as the full implications of Margaret Harrison's revelation began to ripple through the assembled crowd. Someone in the back of the gallery had already pulled out a phone photographing the scene that would soon explode across social media, forcing a national conversation about prejudice in the judiciary and the corruption of power. In an unprecedented move that sent shockwaves through the legal community, Judge William Harrison recused himself from the case, his voice barely audible as he admitted to personal bias and conflict of interest. The words seemed to physically pain him, each syllable carrying the weight of decades of carefully hidden shame. As he stepped down from the bench, his judicial robes suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. The case against Sarah Thompson was dismissed with prejudice by Judge Maria Rodriguez, who took over the proceedings, her strong voice filling courtroom 237 with words about justice, integrity, and the corrupting influence of unchecked bias. The formal acknowledgement of Sarah's innocence, however, felt almost secondary to the larger revolution her case had sparked within the judicial system. Within weeks, the Thompson-Harrison Initiative for Judicial Reform took shape, Sarah channeling her expertise in algorithmic analysis to create a comprehensive database tracking sentencing patterns across the country. The project quickly gained support from legal organizations, civil rights groups, and even conservative judicial reform advocates who recognized the need for transparency in the courts. Margaret Harrison emerged as a powerful voice in the national conversation about judicial bias, her decades of civil rights work lending authority to her calls for systematic change. She shared platform after platform with her daughter Sarah, their combined expertise forcing uncomfortable but necessary discussions in law schools, judicial chambers, and legislative sessions across America. The young law clerk, whose meticulous documentation of Judge Harrison's behavior had helped expose the depth of his prejudice, found herself recruited to help develop new guidelines for judicial oversight, her detailed notes becoming required reading in legal ethics courses. The story of Courtroom 237 transforming from a family drama into a catalyst for institutional change. William Harrison began the long, painful journey of rehabilitation, not just from his public disgrace, but from the prejudices that had poisoned his relationship with his sister. He enrolled in restorative justice workshops, participated in bias training programs, and slowly, painfully began to confront the truth about himself that he had spent decades denying. The media coverage exploded beyond the initial scandal as journalists began digging through Judge Harrison's past cases, discovering patterns of bias that had affected hundreds of lives. Sarah worked tirelessly with legal aid organizations to review these cases, her financial expertise and legal knowledge helping to overturn dozens of questionable convictions. The Goldman Stanley CEO, true to the whispers in the courtroom that day, established a multi-million-dollar fund for reviewing cases of potential judicial bias, the initiative partnering with Sarah's organization to develop artificial intelligence tools capable of detecting patterns of prejudiced decision-making in court records across the country. Margaret Harrison watched her children with mixed emotions as Sarah's organization grew in influence and William struggled to rebuild himself. She has spent her life fighting for justice, but had never imagined her greatest battle would play out within her own family. Her persistence in maintaining a relationship with both her children, despite their estrangement from each other, ultimately proving crucial to the healing process. Law schools across the country incorporated the Thompson-Harrison case into their curriculum, the story becoming a powerful teaching tool about judicial ethics, implicit bias, and the importance of accountability. Sarah found herself regularly invited to speak to law students, her personal experience combining with her professional expertise to deliver a message that resonated deeply with the next generation of legal professionals. The courthouse where everything had unfolded became a symbol of both failure and hope, the very chambers where Judge Harrison had wielded his prejudice Prejudice now hosted regular training sessions on judicial bias and ethical decision-making. Sarah occasionally visited, speaking to groups of judges about the importance of confronting their own biases, her presence in that space a powerful reminder of how truth can transform even the most entrenched systems. William Harrison never returned to the bench but found a different calling, working with rehabilitation programs for formerly incarcerated individuals. His own journey of confronting prejudice, giving him a unique perspective on the possibility of change. Their relationship with his sister remained complicated, but they found common ground in their shared commitment to reforming the system that had almost destroyed them both. The story of Courtroom 237 became more than a cautionary tale about judicial bias. It became a blueprint for change, a reminder that justice requires constant vigilance, and a testament to the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. Sarah Thompson and the brother who had tried to destroy her eventually found their way to a fragile reconciliation, their shared commitment to reform becoming the bridge that helped them begin to rebuild their family bonds.